I want you to explain to the audience what the Enlightenment Gap is briefly so that we're all on the same page.
Perfect. Yeah. So I sort of backed into this concept at first in terms of my own rootedness in it is found in the problem of psychology. The problem of psychology is the inability of scholars to develop a proper relationship between a proper way of understanding the science of psychology. In other words, we developed modern science coming off of Galileo into Newton. In the 19th century, there was a real strong effort to apply the epistemology of science to this thing called psychology. That actually breaks up, and I can explain why, and gives rise to initially called the crisis in psychology, which is that there's no way to define the field in any way that's coherent. The field then decides that, yep, we'll never define the field. And so what we'll do is we'll define ourselves academically by applying the methods of science to whatever the hell it is that which particular researcher decides what they mean by psychology or behavior and mental process. So I got obsessed with the problem of psychology. And then as I was framing the nature of the problem of psychology, especially recently, the evolution of my thought went from a focus on psychology and psychotherapy into really metaphysics, which is basically what the fuck do we mean by our terms? How do we know? What's our epistemology? What's our ontology? And that then got me really aware of how deeply confused everybody is in relation. And then I saw that through the lens of what then would become the Enlightenment Gap, which is the term I coined to say that there was an attempt for a synthetic philosophy that emerged in the context of enlightenment. A synthetic philosophy is a holistic set of metaphysical concepts that afford understanding, so box you in, and afford consilience, to use Edward Wilson's term. And then that broke down, and basically we've never been close to consilience. You could argue maybe Hegel tried that and got closer, but certainly in the West, coming off of England, Great Britain into the United States, we basically adopted an empiricism and gave up on any particular holistic philosophy, and sort of had shattered knowledge. Now, so that's the backdrop. So what exactly is the Enlightenment Gap as I frame it? It's the twin problems, two sides of a coin, as it were, of the inability to properly define the relationship between matter and mind on the one hand, okay? And this is colloquially known as the mind-body problem. It's like, what is consciousness? How does it interact with the physical world? 6 million different attempts to try to sort that out. And everybody's specializing different parts of the problem, and there's no coherence, certainly no shared coherent agreement. So that's one aspect, matter versus mind. The second aspect is, what is scientific knowledge and how ought to be framed in relationship to sociocultural knowledge more generally? So how do we frame what scientific knowledge is? What kind of truth claims does it make relative to more social claims? You can see that we never saw this in relationship to the modernist approach, which generally thinks about science and math and philosophy as potentially obtaining foundational truths or real truths that transcend culture. And then the postmodern critique of that says, no, you're contextually bound into the sociocultural history, systems of justification. They're used for power. They connect to industry and the institutions, and they are always contextually framed. And therefore, there's no transcendent truth claims to be had. And then what's the battle between modern and postmodern in terms of sort of epistemological claims? So that the second part then is the science versus society relation. So the Enlightenment Gap then is basically, the evidence for its mind-body, modern, postmodern confusions, failure to get first principles transcending that, and an inability to achieve any type of consilient understanding. And the UTalk says, actually, what I positioned it as is a pathway in, certainly not necessarily the only pathway, but it's a pathway in to achieve an integrated, pluralistic frame that affords a synthetic philosophy that certainly allows us to transcend, resolve the Enlightenment Gap, and get ourselves on a much more coherent grounding of understanding.
That was awesome. And you did that in like 5 minutes. I'm like, oh, pow, out of the park, man. It's awesome. I can only but write so fast, though. Okay.
Hey, I'm happy to repeat anything or
No,
whatever.
you're good. No, you're good. So the interesting function of it kind of goes to this. So the way I see it, just so I reiterate what you have said in terms that demonstrates that I actually understand and I'm not just merely monkeying along, right? It just goes like this: is the Enlightenment Gap roughly is the failure of science to properly integrate the social sciences or subjective matter into its realm. That was an affirmation, I believe. I want to, because we may have an audio only audience. So,
yeah, absolutely. Yes, I did. I granted that's in terms of one sentence. If you had to nail it down into one sentence, an even briefer description, that's a beautiful start. So I affirm that nice summary.
That's beautiful. Now, I'm gonna alter the subject a little bit, because it's like the issues kind of goes. It's epistemology and ontology and phylogeny, right? And it's like, what is going on here, right? It's like, what exactly is going on here from physics to digital, right?
Beautiful.
And it's like, so this is the proposal that I'm making at this moment, which is to understand this. We must understand layers of complexity. And each layer of complexity has stable equilibria in it that are, and I ran into a fellow named James Connors, and he's a PhD candidate for a field of study I never heard of before I met him, which is ecological psychology.
Yeah, I know that field.
And it's like, wow, that's kind of what I've been studying in my own way, independently for 34 years, because I'm like, that's interesting stuff. And it's like, at issue is this is so at every layer, there's an ecological psychology function at work, and all the layers are self-similar, but increasing layers of complexity as we progress through the hierarchy of complexity, culminating in what we recognize in this subjective realm and socio-political, religious, and then you said it well, which was metaphysical front, right? I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Best Medicine Podcast with Bradley H. Werrell, DO. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe below, either over there or over there. Also, if you're interested in a medical consultation with myself, there's also information below.